I'd like to welcome you to this very full day of a celebration of the last 14 years of CEPAR. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Bateman people that are the traditional custodians of this land where we are today, and pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other First Nations people who are present here today. This is a sort of emotional moment for me to welcome you here, because CEPAR has been such a central part of my life for the past 2 decades, really, because it took quite a while to get it going. But what I'm going to do is let that emotion just dissipate through the day and give you some ground rules. We have, I need to tell you that the event's going to be live streamed and recorded, and so there are going to be bits and pieces that will be uploaded to the website. We'll get appropriate permissions. The emergency exits are, it says here and point to them, but I actually don't know where they are. I think out there, that way, yeah. We have 2 introductory speakers this morning. The first is a new Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, Professor Bronwyn Fox, who's going to speak first. And the second is the Dean of the School of Business, also recently appointed as a Dean, Frederik Anseel. But Frederik has been around for longer. Bronwyn only joined a month ago, and we're very pleased that she has found the time this morning to join us. I think it would be fair to say her background is in engineering, but she's nationally recognized in what looks to me like materials science, carbon fiber and composite materials. She's been appointed by the Minister for Industry Science as Australia's expert advisor to the International Scientific Report on Advanced AI Safety. And that's a multi-country, more than 30 countries are involved with that, so she's Australia's representative. And she has so many distinguished precedents that I'm sure UNSW has made a wonderful appointment. So perhaps without further ado, I could ask Bronwyn to join us.
Thanks so much, John. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Bateman land here today, and I'm constantly reminded that we have so much to learn from the traditional owners of the land about how to respect and revere those amongst us who are elderly. It's really important. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Yes, John, thank you. That is material science and engineering. You got the field right. I've spent most of my life working on a very different field to the one that we're talking about here today. I've worked with fast cars and planes. I've worked on lightweighting transport to reduce environmental emissions. So I've had a lot of fun doing that, had the chance to travel the world and work with Mercedes and Boeing, but I'm really excited to be here today because the work you're doing is so important. It's not just important to society, but it's really important to this university. It's so incredibly aligned with our new thinking about our new strategy, which is focused on societal impact and how we can create an impact in society and help the most vulnerable in our society to thrive and flourish. So congratulations on an incredibly diverse program today. I've been reading a little bit about some of your research outputs, and the work that you've done over the last few years is incredible. Population ageing is a profound and unprecedented global phenomenon with far-reaching socio-economic implications, making this demographic change one of the most major challenges faced by our global society. And it's not going to go away, as you all know. Many people are now living longer, healthier lives than ever before. Whilst it's ultimately a positive thing, research into the multifaceted phenomenon of population ageing is vital to ensure that we can collectively and successfully adapt to and benefit from this demographic shift. Economically, population ageing has significant impacts on labour markets, productivity and economic growth. Socially, we need to consider sustainable well-being for adults, older adults, effective health policies and informed decision-making. So this is where ARC Centres of Excellence, such as CEPAR, the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research, have come into play. CEPAR's research on ageing and financial decision-making, for example, explores how ageing impacts financial literacy and decision-making abilities. CEPAR's researchers have found that financial literacy declines at older ages, whilst confidence in financial decision-making either remains stable or increases, leading to potentially risky decisions or financial mistakes. CEPAR have not only identified this issue, but have developed critical new knowledge around how these risks can be mitigated and how cognitive health can be boosted to support decision-making in older adults, insights made possible by the multidisciplinary, collaborative nature of Centres of Excellences. ARC COEs play a vital role in advancing knowledge, fostering innovation, and addressing the most challenging issues we face as a society, both nationally and internationally. They afford considerable opportunities to researchers, disciplines, and universities by facilitating highly collaborative, cross-disciplinary research, enabling in-depth exploration of complex issues and capacity building. The cutting-edge research generated in COEs then informs policy and practice and leads to improved social outcomes, ensuring that our research has tangible social impact and real-world benefits. I'm proud to say that CEPAR is a stellar example of a highly effective and impactful Centre of Excellence, and a credit to the University of New South Wales and its wonderful partners with nodes at the Australian National University, Curtin University, the University of Melbourne and the University of Sydney. Established in March 2011 and now coming to the end of its second 7-year funding period, phenomenal achievement. CEPAR embodies successful collaboration between academia, government and industry through its multidisciplinary program of research that enables individuals, businesses and governments to better respond to the broad socio-economic challenges posed by an ageing population. As a result of CEPAR's outstanding work, Australia is positioned as a well-informed nation, better equipped to tackle one of the major challenges of the 21st century. You will hear more about CEPAR's successes over the course of today's showcase, with diverse topics ranging from age-inclusive workplaces and mature workers to modelling retirement income risks and solutions, and navigating age, gender and care in our multi-generational workforces. In what looks like to be a dynamic and engaging program, we'll welcome over 24 speakers from CEPAR's partner universities in the field of actuarial science, demography, economics, epidemiology, psychology, industrial relations, organisational behaviour and sociology to create a unique combination of cross-disciplinary expertise. It's, as was mentioned, it's just over a month since I joined the University of New South Wales's DBCRE, and it's been an absolute pleasure to explore the breadth and depth of the incredible research that's being done not only at this university, but in collaboration with our deep partnerships. So thank you all for the work you've contributed to CEPAR, and thanks for the opportunity to join you here today. I wish you all the best for a really thought-provoking and engaging day.
So thank you very much, Bronwyn, for those remarks and for joining us this morning. The second speaker is someone that many of you will know better. Frederik Anseel has been in the School of Business, first as the Deputy Dean for Research, and then as the Senior Deputy Dean, and now as Dean. And I would like to welcome him to say a few words by way of introduction.
Good morning, everyone. I know a lot of introductions. You want to get to the real part, which is about research, of course. When I woke up this morning, I was sort of going back and forth between joy and celebration and a bit of sadness, because this also is sort of, we're going towards the end of everything that has been achieved in CEPAR. But then sort of the joy took over because I'm also dreaming of new beginnings. And John, maybe you're only at the start of a new era in doing research. And let me explain why I'm dreaming of new beginnings is because at the business school, we're sort of articulating a new strategy around careers that matter and ideas that matter. And people ask me, what do you mean with ideas that matter? And then I often take CEPAR as an example. And John does not like to brag, but he knows this because we have many conversations about this. The CEPAR model is almost a pre-scienced way of working that the new strategy of the business school is sort of following that model. And I'll highlight, I think, what are three key aspects of what CEPAR is doing that we want to sort of amplify and almost replicate at the business school level, right? The first one is this idea that researchers in a business school are not only about, let's say, teaching MBA students or making people successful in individual careers, but basically that we have a lot to offer in research insights to policymakers, right? And so this idea that research in a business school should aim at a societal level and help solve important societal problems, actually do more than, we're not responding only to problems, we are actually setting the agenda of the problems that should be solved in society. And so, for instance, there's this quote from a Canadian ice skater, Wayne Gretzky. People probably know Wayne Gretzky. And Wayne Gretzky is famous for a quote. He said, I think, I am skating where the puck is going to be, not where it has been, right? And I think that is what CEPAR did. I think aging populations, I think that was set on the agenda more than 10 years ago by CEPAR as sort of highlighting this is a crucial issue that every single country, every single government of developed countries will be struggling with. And we do not have the research, we do not have the data, we do not have the policies to deal with this, right? And so this is the type of research that we want to do on the basis of data and knowledge, creating knowledge that actually help almost anticipate future problems. And I think that has been very important. That has been an achievement of CEPAR by putting this on the agenda long before others started talking about it. And if you now these days read the Financial Times or The Economist, not a week goes by that these topics are being discussed. But John, what CEPAR was doing was way before that, a decade, 15 years ago. So I think that is a model to follow. The second one is, in the past, I think academics and business school academics often have this tendency to focus on their own research agenda, doing great research, publishing that research in the top journals, and then it's sort of, let's throw it over the fence and hope that somebody uses it and somebody runs with it and applies it. And it's no surprise to say that often that does not happen, right? And if you look at the statistics, a lot of the research that is being done in business schools, social sciences, is never cited at all, is never used at all. And the thing we need to learn to do is we need to design for impact, which means that before you start the research, you basically already involve the stakeholders, the end users, the people that you want to influence in the design of the studies, right? And that means, for instance, involving policymakers, decision makers, at the start, before you do the research, to sort of think, what are actually the problems that we want to solve, and can we do the research in a way that is most useful to those end users? And again, and we've had many conversations about this, John, but also Professor Bateman, Hazel Bateman, Mark, chair of the advisory board. I think in the past years, we've always talked about this. How can we do this better? How can we design for impact when we do research? And I think CEPAR has been really a sort of an example for everyone in the business school. So that is something that we really want to do in the future. And of course, and it's already been mentioned, the third aspect is this idea of bringing disciplines together. There's this tendency that you say, oh, interdisciplinary research, of cross-disciplinary research, or transdisciplinary research. I don't know the difference between those things. This idea is we need to bring them together and great things will happen. It's probably true, but it's very hard to do. And I don't think just doing interdisciplinary research for the sake of it is very useful. I think what CEPAR has done is sort of looking at a big societal problem and then think about what are the specific perspective and lenses that we need to do to solve this. This is the way to do it. And what happens then is then separate from disciplines, I think that is what transdisciplinary research is, that separate from disciplines, a new space emerges where a new language and a new way of thinking emerges to tackle that problem. And I was very pleasantly surprised. Katja, sitting here, told me last week she had a paper published in Nature Aging. And so that's where we're aiming for, right? At some point, we transcend the disciplinary journals to join a global conversation that happens in that new space. And if top journals like Nature create a separate journal, Nature Aging, and we are able to join and shape that conversation, that is where we want to play as a business school. And so I think these three things are really sort of setting the example for the future of where we want to go. And so, John, that's why I'm saying we're dreaming of new beginnings, because this is where we can go. So I want to congratulate. We'll have an overview of all the great things, all the research that has happened at CEPAR. I want to congratulate everyone involved, the advisory board, the researchers involved, all the staff involved. It's been great. You've been a leading example of how research can be done in the social sciences, and we're really proud in the business school to be able to host CEPAR here. So I hope you all have a great day, and I hope this is not the end, but this is the beginning of a lot of new things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frederik. They were great words. Thank you. Now we get into, as Frederik called it, the meat, right? And the meat is going to be overseen in this first session by Warwick McKibbin. Warwick's a very distinguished professor of economics at the ANU. He's also an external fellow of the Brookings Institution in DC. And he's been an incredibly supportive chief investigator of CEPAR for the past 7 years. So I'll just turn the chairing over to Warwick now. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. Could I ask the first two speakers to please come up to the stage, because we have a very short amount of time to do a great deal. I'd first like to thank John in particular for inviting me to join CEPAR 7 years ago. When John asked me, I thought I didn't have enough time to do such an ambitious project. But having joined CEPAR, it's had a substantial impact on my research, and this interdisciplinary interactions has just been a fantastic experience. This first session then is, it's like a 10-minute thesis exercise where each presenter gets to present their work in a 10-minute slot, and we have 5 minutes of Q&A from the audience. It's going to be hard to manage the time, particularly since I'm in the next session. I don't want to crowd myself out. So let's start with the first speaker. Oh, I should mention all of the speakers are from the University of New South Wales, so I don't have to introduce their institution. All the speakers are chief investigators of CEPAR, so that's done. So I'll just mention their names and where they are. Okay, let me hand over to Mike Keane from the School of Economics.
Okay, so our area is called Rational Choice Theory in Consumers. I've listed here a bunch of the people who were part of this stream: Tim Neal, Lena Capatina, Fedor Iskakov, Zhangling Liu, Han Gao, Kaya Kirov, Alan Woodland, Payman, Naem. Okay. So I'm just gonna list kind of 4 or 5 major projects that we worked on. One, and I've just highlighted significant papers that came out of each project. So the first project looked at consumers' choices of Medicare prescription drug plans in the U.S. Now the background of this is that rational choice theory in economics assumes that more choices always make consumers better off, right? So what we did in this project was develop a new type of choice model that accounts for consumer confusion, as a result of which more choices can actually make consumers worse off. If I can, oops. Okay, so we applied that model to study the prescription drug insurance market for senior citizens in the U.S., a market where consumers typically face about 30 to 60 potential options. So it's quite a complicated choice they need to make. We find that consumers rarely make the optimal choice, the drug plan that would minimize their total costs, but welfare losses are small because they usually choose a sort of okay plan that might not be too bad. However, we found that the welfare losses are much greater for various vulnerable groups, such as people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease and depression. Okay, this is tricky because there's a lag from when you click to the. Yeah, right. It's monetary policy. The second paper studied the impact of the age pension in Australia on human capital accumulation and labor supply. In this work, we used a dynamic life cycle model with both financial assets and human capital to study the impact of the age pension. We found that making age pension means testing more strict, which would of course save money, which would therefore enable you to have income tax cuts in a balance to achieve a balanced budget. The combination of making the age pension means testing stricter along with the tax cuts would actually make all new cohorts of workers better off. The reason is that these changes in the tax code would increase labor supply and human capital accumulation over the life cycle. The third major project is a project with Elena Capatina at ANU, where we're building health shocks, and health insurance and human capital into the standard canonical life cycle labor supply model. This work is applied to the US context, but I think it has broad lessons. We find that in the US context, the lack of Medicare for all, the fact that insurance is tied to employment and a lot of people don't have insurance through work, has a perverse incentive for low-skill workers, giving them an incentive to curtail their labor supply in order to maintain eligibility for various welfare programs that cover medical costs for the uninsured. As a result, Medicare for All has the previously unnoted advantage that it encourages labor supply and human capital accumulation on top of the obvious advantage of improving health outcomes. A third major project, fourth major project with Zhang Liu is called Tax Preferences and Housing Affordability Explorations Using a Life Cycle Model. This project is almost done, but not written up yet. This is the first paper to incorporate financial assets, owner-occupied housing, and investment property as state variables in a life cycle model. In the US context, we find that the mortgage interest tax deduction does not make housing more affordable for low-income people. It mostly just causes rich people to buy bigger houses. In contrast, making the interest deduction fully refundable, which simply means you get the money even if you don't owe much in taxes, would increase the demand for housing by low-income households. So we're arguing that a refundable tax credit is one way to improve affordability of housing for low-income workers. The final major project I'll mention, this is with Han Gao, Kaya Kirov, and Alan Woodland. It's called Optimal Tax Policy Meets Modern Labor Supply Theory. Dynamic stochastic equilibrium models, or DSGE models, are typically used to study optimal tax policy. This is the first paper, I believe, to calibrate a DSGE model to fit data on life cycle labor supply and wage paths in a way that labor economists would find acceptable. Typically, when macroeconomists do these models, they just fit a tiny number of macro statistics, and they don't pay too much attention to fitting the individual life cycle paths. This is the point we're at. We've just managed to get this model to fit in a satisfactory way, and now we're turning to use it to study optimal tax policy. And our preliminary results seem to indicate that once you account for human capital in these DSGE models, it means that the optimal income tax is both lower and less progressive, while on the other hand, the optimal capital tax is higher. So you have this interesting mix of kind of a sort of conservative result and a more progressive result, if you will. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Mike. Do we have any questions for Mike? And could I please get someone to pass around a microphone so that we can hear the questions? Please raise your hand if you have a question for Mike. Yes, we have a question. I actually can't see very well, but yeah.
Thank you, Mike. A very simple question. Quite a lot of your studies drew on US data, so I'd be curious to understand how much the findings apply to Australian context or how much you have to customise. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think most of these studies are giving sort of broad lessons about how people behave, how consumers behave, how workers behave. Specifically the housing paper and this tax policy paper, we're going to eventually fit in the Australian rules, and apply it to the Australian context. It's just that kind of the way economics goes is that if you can't get your project published in the US journals, no one pays any attention to it, right? So, so you got to start out by fitting the US data if you want anyone to listen to you.
I think, George, is that you with your hand about to go up?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I would like to ask about this project on the DSGE models. I mean, typically, these models kind of model aggregate uncertainties. So basically, you shock the producer's productivity. I mean, is that what you model here, or here kind of you assume you're modeling idiosyncratic uncertainty? Is that what kind of you're doing here?
The individuals in the model are getting idiosyncratic wage shocks over their life cycle. Yeah. So the emphasis is on this individual risk, right? And of course, this individual risk creates an incentive to have redistributive taxes, right? To help support the people who get negative shocks. So that's one of the mechanisms in the model.
So I have a question, if it's okay. The time has stopped. I don't know if that means we've run out of time or we've run out of... but anyway, my question is, does your result hold for the capital taxation if you have an open economy? Because you're assuming a closed US economy, which we know is not right.
Yeah, we're assuming a closed economy. We would have to modify the model to factor in an open economy where capital could potentially leave. I guess what I would argue is there's a lot of evidence of a tremendous home bias in capital investment. So I think that capital flows between countries are not anywhere near infinitely elastic, right? There's a lot of friction there. So I doubt the result would change too dramatically.
Thank you. I think we might move on. So Kaarin Anstey in the School of Psychology, over to you.
Hi, well, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to be here, but like John mentioned, we have mixed feelings about being at the end of CEPAR. Talking about highlights on cognitive ageing, decision-making and productive ageing. Obviously, it's impossible to discuss everything that we've done in the last 7 years, and also to include everybody who's been a part of our stream and a part of this work. So I sort of want to almost start off with an apology and an acknowledgement that there's a lot more than what I'm going to present today. And I'm really trying to focus on some of the work led by our postdoctoral fellows and our associate investigators. So I just wanted to start off by talking about cognitive decline. For those of you who are not from a psychology background, we do see a normal trajectory in ageing in people who don't have dementia. And what we would all like to see is, for all of us, is to have what we call normal cognitive ageing. And a lot of our CEPAR work has focused on normal cognitive ageing and what we can do to ensure that people do age normally in cognition, and we've tried to identify risk and protective factors associated with normal cognitive ageing. And then we've also started, because what happens is as people decline, they can pass a threshold where they have mild cognitive impairment. And so we're very interested in what is increasing the risk of moving into that domain and what protects people. And further down the line, we have more significant cognitive impairment leading to dementia. And we have done some population global estimates looking at that, because there's some very interesting gender differences in cognitive ageing. So throughout our work, I will be mentioning gender. So this first piece of work was led by Hamid Al-Hook, who's an associate investigator. In this piece, we synthesised the global evidence on sex differences in the prevalence of dementia, Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, because everybody says dementia is more prevalent in women. We see a lot more women with dementia. And we were wondering if this was because women lived longer. So this is a real population ageing question. Is this an artefact of population ageing differences between men and women? And what we found was that actually in the global literature, there was no sex differences in the prevalence of dementia when you took longevity into account, except in the over 90s. However, for Alzheimer's disease, there are a greater number of women with Alzheimer's disease. We also looked at incidence, and it does appear then, once we correct for all of those factors, and we also looked at country differences and gender inequality, it does seem that women are more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease than men. A lot of the work that we did in CEPAR that I'm going to talk about today was based on the Path Through Life cohort study, because we used our funding from CEPAR to fund a follow-up of two of the cohorts, the midlife cohort, who were aged 59 to 63, and the oldest cohort, who are aged 80 to 84. So that was the main data collection project that our CEPAR money funded. That gave us 20 years of follow-up of this cohort. And so for ageing research, it's really important that we have longitudinal data, and we can look at within-person changes longitudinally, as well as between-person changes. So we were really lucky to have this data set, because it's probably the only data set in the world where you actually have the same cognitive measures on different age groups over time. And because of that, we were actually able to model what cognitive ageing looks like in the normal population in Australia. But this is actually rare data. I think it's the only publication like this globally. So we were able to show that there are stable sex differences in memory at all ages and at all occasions of measurement. So women had better memories than men, and that was shown. If you look at the top left corner, you can see in the 20-year-old cohort, who we assessed 4 times, memory performance actually improved over the 12 years of follow-up report in this paper. In middle age, memory was stable, and in late life, memory declined. But at all occasions of measurement, women had better memory than men. And what you can see is that in that oldest cohort, so in the 60 to 64 through to 70 to 76, you see that the slope is starting to decline, and there's a statistically significant difference in the slope between men and women between the last 2 follow-ups. And what we saw in our population-based data was that memory performance in women was declining more rapidly than in men. And that really fits with the picture of Alzheimer's disease being more prevalent in women, because the first symptom of Alzheimer's disease usually is memory ageing. We were also able to look at other cognitive abilities in the same way. We looked at reaction time. We found men had faster reaction times than women at all ages and at all occasions of measurement. And we looked at processing speed, where there were not very big gender differences. And we also looked at verbal ability. And as expected, we found that our oldest cohort had much better verbal ability than middle-aged and younger adults. So, as I said, we're really interested in things that protect cognitive ageing so we can maintain the cognitive function in the population and support productive ageing. And this work is led by Yvonne Jung, who is, I think, here today. She is a CEPAR fellow. This was also based on the PAST study, and Yvonne looked at cognitive resilience, and the way she measured that was looking at measures of education, occupation, verbal intelligence, and leisure activity. And what she found was that lower occupational skill was associated with higher risk of development of mild cognitive impairment in men, but not in women. So we've seen this quite often. Again, this is where gender differences are coming in. We can't look at these questions without considering gender, because the patterns often are quite different. She also found that one standard deviation increase in leisure activity was associated with lower risk of developing cognitive impairment by 32%. And that was true for men and women. So that's something protective that we can do to stay on that normal trajectory for cognitive aging, which is where we all want to stay. And she found that higher scores on verbal intelligence were associated with lower risk of mild cognitive impairment. The next paper was led by Lidan Zheng, who's also here today. She's a CEPAR associate investigator, and this also used the Path Through Life study. And in this study, we were also interested in looking at cognitive resilience, but we defined it in terms of genetic risk. So we know that there's a genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease called the apolipoprotein E allele. And so we picked out and we had genotyped the cohort. We were able to identify the subgroup who had that genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease, who we would expect to decline, particularly memory aging, as I showed you in that first slide. Now, what we found, if you look at that group, you do find that there's a subgroup in there who are not declining. And that's how we define cognitive resilience, that we define the people who have the genetic risk but are not showing memory decline and cognitive decline as cognitively resilient. So then the question is, what is different about that group? How are they resilient despite having genetic risk for Alzheimer's disease? And what Lidan found was that, again, gender differences in the results. For men, it was increased frequency of mild physical activity was associated with being cognitive resilient, less frequent vigorous physical activity, which is we don't really understand why that was the case, but it's what we found, and also being employed. And then among women, the predictors of that cognitive resilience group were the number of mental activities that they were engaged in. So quite different factors influencing cognitive resilience. In another paper led by Ramali Eramadagala, who's a member of our team, a clinical neuropsychologist, she was interested in social engagement and mild cognitive impairment. And what she found was that people with mild cognitive impairment and dementia report smaller social networks, which is not surprising. But people with mild cognitive impairment did not report being more lonely. But I think what's important is that having these conditions impaired social cognition, and that's the ability to read the room, to understand social dynamics, what's going on in a social situation. And so having a mild cognitive impairment in later life, and we know that 1 in 5 adults over the age of 70 have a mild cognitive impairment, it does can affect social relationships because of that. Another part of our research focused on decision-making, and this work was led by Craig Sinclair, who was one of our CEPAR fellows. I believe you're going to hear from Craig later today. This also focused on the Path Through Life cohort, because we'd actually included a measure called Game of Dice task in the past cohort. So we were able to look at decision-making on that task and then relate it to other variables that we were interested in. So in this first paper, Craig was interested in identifying types of decision makers. So is there a typology that we can identify in the data? He found 3 types, and this is a cross-sectional paper, and he found that there was an advantageous cluster of people who made better decisions. They were younger, more likely to be men, and had better memory scores. And there was a disadvantageous cluster. They had slower time in a task on executive function. And executive function is a cognitive ability that actually declines in normal aging. And we know that that influences your capacity to make good decisions. In the second paper on decision-making, we were interested in how decision-making how mild cognitive impairments may impact decision making. Given that mild cognitive impairment is so prevalent in the population, so I mean, there's a lot of concern about dementia, but in fact, people with mild cognitive impairments are living independently in the community. They may be managing their own finances and their daily life, but they still have some cognitive impairments. And we did find that this group had impaired decision making, so they had lower overall scores. They made more strategy changes. But what we found was a continuum. So people with more types of mild cognitive impairments had poorer scores. We also looked at trying to apply this concept of decision-making changing in older age. We were interested in how that related to what we call an instrumental activity of daily living. So the instrumental activities of daily living are things like driving, managing your finances, etc. So we were able to look at cognitive ageing and driving, and here is a map of the driving route that was used in this study. The data for this study was based on a Canberra cohort, and you can see that we had our sample conduct a driving test with an occupational therapist, and they were scored.
Kaarin, we're a bit over, so could you...
Oh, sorry.
Yep, nearly done. Thanks.
Okay, sorry. So basically we found that decision-making was an independent predictor of driving research. And this was led by Brooke Brady, who's also here today, and this is also the first time this has been shown globally. So I just want to finish off on our translational outputs. We've developed risk assessment tools which you can access online with that QR code. We've informed government reports, the Communique website. A number of our papers are published in the Lancet Commission on Dementia, WHO guidelines. We've developed fact sheets and other translational outputs. Thank you. This is the team.
Thanks, Kaarin. We have time for a quick question. Otherwise, we shall move on to Hazel Bateman on guiding financial decision-making for and in retirement.
Okay, thank you very much. This is indeed a challenge. Okay, so it's terrific to present to everyone, and it's probably a shame that it's the last time that we're all meeting as a group, but I'm sure we've made lots of connections and we'll keep working together in various forms. So my topic my research program funded by CEPAR related to financial decisions close to and through retirement. And the context here is these decisions are complex. There's a lot of decisions. We're thinking about drawing down a superannuation, spending our financial assets. We're in retirement, we're thinking about housing, health and aged care. Increasingly, whether on intergenerational transfers, we may retire through choice, we may be forced to retire, we may retire as a couple or a single and change through retirement. So there's a lot of things going on. There's a number of key risks we can face: inflation, investment, longevity, health and aged care. And the important thing from my context is the superannuation choice architecture provides much less support in retirement. So when we're working, we're forced to join a super fund, we have a high minimum contribution rate, we have default options. As soon as we retire, we're faced with a lot of decisions. And I like to think of it, it's like when you start work and someone gives you $1 million and says, right, you've got $1 million, you don't know what sort of work you're going to have, you don't know your family circumstances, you don't know your health, you don't know when you're going to retire. But you've got to work out how to spend that $1 million through your working life. And that's a little bit what we're like in retirement. A lot of the research we've done here is we've built theoretical models and we've looked at the mismatch between theory and practice. And we've been looking at ways to help people make better financial decisions during this complex retirement. This is multidisciplinary work, so we've had economists, people from finance, people from actuarial studies, people from psychology, and some of our projects, people from marketing. And we've used multi-methods, so we've had theoretical models, we've used data, administrative data from superannuation funds, and also experimental data. So we've done a lot of things, and hopefully in the 7 minutes and 36 I have left, I can take you through it. One of the things we've done is build life cycle models to look at sort of whether there's welfare gains from having certain sort of insurance products in retirement. So we've looked at the welfare gains of new products such as long-term care insurance, of existing products such as annuities, of critical illness insurance in a Chinese context where there's a gap in that market, and also of reverse mortgages. And in every case we find that there's welfare gains, but I guess the puzzle to us then becomes, in practice, these products either don't exist, like long-term care insurance in Australia, or people don't take up the products. And so on our annuities paper, for example, we found it was probably optimal to take 25% or something like that of your superannuation as an annuity. We know that hardly anybody takes annuities in Australia. You know, maybe 3% of retirement savings are taken as annuities. So that creates a puzzle. Another puzzle we see in retirement is not just in Australia, but in many other countries, people save for retirement, and whether they get effectively a lump sum in the Australian context and have to decide how to spend it down, or whether they get annuities in the Dutch context where they're getting a regular payment for life, we find that people are continuing to save in retirement or not spending down as fast as we think they should. So one of the early papers that I did when I first joined CEPAR in the second version of CEPAR was an experimental study set in Australia and the Netherlands where we asked people in the experiment to choose spending trajectories and then justify why they'd chosen those trajectories. And we could back out the motives for people's spending and saving patterns in retirement. And one of the things that came out in both countries is precautionary saving. You know, people are concerned about spending too much in retirement, wanting to continue to save, whether it be out of pensions in the Netherlands or out of their superannuation in Australia, because they're concerned about health and long-term care expenses. Interestingly, Australia and the Netherlands are probably two countries in the OECD that you don't really have to worry as much as other countries about this. But you know, people have this perception that they need to hold back money for precautionary expenses. A key component of the research that was conducted in my research program in CEPAR was looking at ways to help people make retirement decisions. And you know, there's various ways people can do this, through choice architecture, through providing them information, through education, financial literacy education and advice. The projects I'm talking about in the next few minutes are looking at the first two of these, looking at choice architecture and information architecture. And in many of these projects, we worked with superannuation funds. And so we've worked with UniSuper, we've worked with CBUS, and we've worked with the WareSuper. And in each of those cases, we've been able to use data, so real data on what people are doing in the funds, and also run experiments or surveys on fund members. So the first item, how can we help people with retirement decisions? We can set up a choice architecture. So the first paper I'd like to highlight is a paper that was nicely published in the Economic Journal, and key co-author Isabella is in the front row. And this is a structural model looking at sort of choices and active decisions in a large superannuation fund. And in the structural model, what one could do is to switch on and off the defaults and see whether the default settings were actually welfare enhancing or not. And so this was a really nice paper because we could actually find out, I guess, the cost of switching, the switching costs, but also the welfare implications of changing the default settings. In another paper, which was an experimental paper, we looked at, also set in Australia and the Netherlands, we were looking at the impact of an effective default. So in the Australian retirement system, we have an account-based pension, which most people take, and that's sort of an effective default. And we found out, sort of in this paper, that Australians tended to stick to that because they saw it as a government implied endorsement of this is what they should do. We also looked at information architecture. So information architecture is giving people information to help them make decisions. It can be prescribed government product disclosure information, or just information given by a financial institution or superannuation fund. So here we looked at product fact sheets. In fact, the fact sheets, which were part of a Treasury discussion paper in 2018, And we found that people did respond to these fact sheets, but they actually didn't understand the information in them. I also have a nice paper with Katja Hannevold, which I imagine she'll mention this afternoon, which was looking at reverse mortgages in China. And China set up a reverse mortgage scheme. Only about 140 people out of the millions of people in China took this up. And when we looked at the product disclosure, it was written by actuaries for consumers. And when we ran an experiment and we simplified the information, pre-tested the information, gave people case studies so they could understand the implications of their choice, we got much, much higher, significantly higher interest in the products. Another aspect of our research is we've looked at wealth and income projections to help people make superannuation decisions. Now, saving for superannuation should be all about income, but it's never framed in an income form. Most of us, when we receive our annual statements until very recently, will have a current balance, and we're expected to translate that to a future balance at retirement and a future income stream to work out whether this is adequate or not. So we conducted some nice work with CBUS, the superannuation fund, who had been putting projections on their statements since 2012. And we had the administrative data, and we could see whether, over time, putting those projections actually changed the behaviour of members. And we found there was a significant increase in contributions, but important, a significant increase in people's interaction with the pension fund, with the superannuation fund. So once they saw this information on their statement, and the information will also include calls of action that people could do. Once they saw that and maybe it didn't match up with their expectations, people actually interacted more with the fund. In additional work, I guess in supplementary work, we extended that through experiments to see whether we could change people's spending behaviour in retirement by giving them income projections. And in an experimental sense, we found just inviting people to think about drawing down in retirement changed their behaviour. Giving them income and wealth projections also helped their behaviour. But I guess there's a red light. If we supplemented that information by giving people information about an age pension or some sort of retirement standard like the ASFA standard, for those in the room who know what that is, people use that as an anchor. So if you gave them some additional information, say the ASFA standard for a comfortable retirement is $45,000 a year, people started using that as an anchor to start their drawdowns.
2 minutes.
Okay. We also have a small group of work that looked at giving people additional sort of tools to help them make decisions. And so very, very simple online calculators, like pre-populated calculators. And in the first paper, it was to help people understand index funds and the fees and returns on index funds. And we found we could give people calculators to help them understand, but as soon as we took the calculator away, they started making poor decisions again. And so they could do 20 repetitions using a calculator, but they actually hadn't really learnt anything. We take the calculator away and they don't make good decisions. In the second paper, it was again trying to help people understand annuities and longevity insurance and the difference between buying a product that's going to last for life and buying a product that's going to run out. And so this was a rather complicated experiment, but the key thing that we wanted to do was to elicit people's willingness to pay and willingness to accept longevity products. And if people used a calculator to understand the difference between the products, they became a lot closer in their subjective estimation of willingness to pay and willingness to accept. Without the calculator, they were way apart. So we think that giving people simple calculators to help them understand simple things, these were both pre-populated calculators, is helping people with these complex decisions. One of the interesting things that happen, I guess, in retirement decisions is we're always trying to engage people, make things easier for people. And we have two papers which look at what happens if we take away these frictions. And I'm just going to talk about one of them because I'm in negative time. Yeah. The COVID early access scheme. So when COVID happened, one of the government's responses was to allow people to take 2 lots of $10,000 out of their superannuation account. No frictions. One could just get on MyGov, go through a few clicks, and you had $10,000. And some of us in the team tried this in a meeting, and we almost took $10,000 out of our accounts. And so what happens here in a frictionless world? Well, we know there's a lot of papers that say that people used this money, they needed it to, buy their groceries and whatever. But we surveyed people in a superannuation fund who'd done that and asked them about their motivations and their understanding of what they'd done. And we found that many people took the money out, not for current needs, for future needs. They made their decisions quickly. They accessed either the entire $10,000 or their full account, and they didn't understand the impact of that on their retirement savings. So finally, in my minus 5 minutes, we have two papers in progress. One is to combine superannuation decisions with housing decisions. And this, again, is a large structural model. And interestingly, this shows that superannuation and housing are complementary decisions and not substitutes. And then the second paper, we're looking again at annuity decisions. And I guess finally, I need to acknowledge all the contributors to all of these projects. Many of our contributors started as PhD students and postdocs and have gone on to wonderful careers. And so that's been one of the great benefits of CEPAR. And one of the things I've really enjoyed is taking people as a PhD student, as a postdoc, and we see that many of them have gone to work at universities overseas or in the private sector in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Hazel. So I think, unfortunately, we have to move on because we're out of time. So next speaker is Michael Sherris on managing and modelling longevity and disability risks in retirement.
Hi, everybody. I'd just like to start by acknowledging collaborators and also John Piggott for making so many opportunities available for so many people in many different disciplines in researching in the population ageing research area that I've benefited immensely from, and also the opportunities that have come from working with young researchers, postdocs, PhD students, and also collaborators in the school and internationally. So most of what I'm just going to talk about, which won't be very detailed, but will give you an idea of what we have been working on in CEPAR, has come from working with very smart young individuals who have contributed a lot to this area and have gone on to great careers, and some of them are still finishing PhDs and working as postdocs. And I thank them from the bottom of my heart for all your hard work and also for your great collaboration. So the areas that we've focused on in terms of our modelling, it comes from an actuarial insurance perspective, which I know most of you now, having heard the word actuarial and insurance, decide now to go to sleep and turn off. But it's covered modelling of risks. So we all know that when we are getting old, there are lots of risks, and we manage risks with financial and insurance products, and that's been our focus, understanding the risks and modelling the different risks around functional disability and also chronic illness, because these are things that impact your need for income and also how you enjoy your retirement, and also how products are designed to cover those risks. One of the main risks, of course, is our mortality risk when we're going to die, and we know that we've been living longer, what they call systematic improvement. But how do you model that, and then what's the uncertainty around it? You know, a lot of people will understand, oh, on average I live so long, and there's certain probabilities that I live so long. But they don't realise there's a lot of uncertainty in those probabilities, and there's trends in those probabilities. So a lot of the models don't take that into account when looking out into the future and planning for retirement and working out what products you want and how to price the products. So we focused on incorporating trends and the uncertainty in the trends. And it's the uncertainty that's very important, because that's where insurance plays an important role. It's the uncertainty. It's not your average time of death, it's the uncertainty around that. And you need to understand that. So we've been developing models of that uncertainty that can be applied not only for individuals but for products by insurers. We've also looked at aged care financing, because that's a major risk in terms of your retirement. And long-term care insurance doesn't exist in Australia. It exists in some countries, but these types of insurance can be very beneficial in managing your risk in retirement, and you need to understand how to model and price those, and that's been part of our research. And finally, we've looked a little bit at investment risk, both pre and post-retirement, and how you can manage that risk better. So I'm just going to cover briefly some of these ideas. So in terms of modelling functional disability and chronic illness, our focus has been incorporating trends and uncertainty in the models that people use. So a lot of the models that actuaries use and others use just assume the same probabilities through time that you'll become ill as you age or that you'll become functionally disabled. They don't include trends, but trends are very important. But not only are trends very important, it's the uncertainty around those trends. If you don't incorporate the uncertainty around those trends, then you're wasting your time, because there's a lot of uncertainty out into the future, and we need to quantify that uncertainty. So we've been developing models that not only capture those trends, but incorporate the uncertainty. And this is not something that's done in many of the models. So many of the research papers that you will read by many disciplines, even the actuarial disciplines, won't incorporate these trends and uncertainties when they're modelling things like functional disability and chronic illness, and pricing insurance without such a model will not be sensible. It's been the reason why some of these markets for long-term care insurance have been unable to exist, because the uncertainty in trends haven't been considered properly. So we've published a number of papers in journals. So some of the collaborators here, you can see the names of them. They're former students, postdocs, and so on. Systematic modelling with uncertainty. So we've developed a way of modelling mortality that builds on demographic models, but it also links in with financial models of risk, so modelling interest rates and so on. When you model mortality risk, you can model it in a consistent financial way that can be used and incorporated when you're modelling interest rate, financial modelling of interest rates in products and so on. So we've developed these modelling frameworks that link into the financial side, that incorporate the trends and uncertainties. They can be used for pricing. And we put a lot of effort. We've developed a software, an R software, that estimates these models. We've published recently just a paper that actually gives details of this software, so others who are researchers or in industry who want to use these models of systematic mortality risk that we've developed will be able to use the software in R that we've developed. And so here's some of the references. The top paper there, the affine mortality and R package for estimation, analysis and projection of affine mortality models, just published, is the paper I referred to. But we've been working on this area for quite a number of years, and there's some of the papers there. Aged care financing, long-term care insurance has been something we've been interested, particularly in the Australian context, and following the Royal Commission into aged care, we've been developing models for Australian functional disability that can be used to design aged care insurance type products that link with the government provided benefits. We know that there are issues around aged care financing from government provided benefits in Australia, adequacy and so on, of waiting times and so on. So we've been designing private long-term care insurance products that can integrate with the Australian aged care system the government provides. They don't exist at the moment, but it's potentially an area that would develop and would be very beneficial for many older Australians as they hit retirement. And here's some of the references. We're still finalising a project around modelling aged care financing and the government costs, and how the system issues around sustainability remain, although the government thinks that maybe they go away by just throwing a small amount of money in the short term at the problem. The problem is in the long term, this is going to be a major issue. If you just look short term like politicians, you're just going to get into a worse and worse situation, and that's what's happening in Australia. Finally, the investment side. So when people talk about risk and investing in risk, you know, they talk about, a certain level of volatility, high volatility, low volatility, and so on. And then it's translated into an investment strategy that has a certain percentage in equity and a certain percentage in fixed interest. The higher the percentage in equity, then the higher the risk. And so there's a consideration of the risk relates to what percentage you have of your assets in equity. But what we know is that the volatility or the risk in equity varies, right? It's not the same, it goes up and down. So if you're just thinking about risk in terms of volatility, you're thinking in a world where volatility doesn't change. But in reality, we know volatility changes. And so if you want to manage your investments to a risk measure, a level of risk, you have to manage in the context of changing volatility or changing risk. And that means changing exposures to equity. So if someone comes along and says, well, you just have 60% in equity and 40% in debt, and you keep it like that, and away you go, and you're going to have this level of risk, that is not right, because volatility changes, and you're going to have to change your volatility. And so there are techniques that have been developed that manage risk in a very efficient way, that not only manage risk better, but also produce higher returns. And we've been working in this area for a number of years, developing methods that actually manage risk better, and not only manage risk better, produce higher returns because of the way they manage risk. And then here's some of the papers. We've just had a paper published in the Annals where we look at, for example, this strategy being implemented for investment with leverage constraints and so on. And as you know, actuaries, there's a saying that, and I used to tell my students this, actuaries like people to be dead on time. And I've got 10 seconds to go, 8 seconds to go, 7 seconds to go. So my details are on this last slide, and I'm going to be also dead on time.
Thanks, Michael. You took away my punchline, but that's okay. Now, questions from the floor. We've got... No. We have 5 minutes. Do we have a question? If we don't, I think it's probably rather... Oh, yes, we do. I can't see, but if someone could give a microphone.
Yep. Hi. Quick question. Did you look at the volatility of other asset classes in addition to equities?
Yeah, no, we focus just on equities. Obviously, there are other asset classes that have different levels of volatility, but we basically just looked at bonds plus equities. But what you need is, to implement these kinds of strategies, you need liquid markets, futures markets and so on to do it efficiently. And so some of those other asset classes may not have those kinds of markets. So we're looking at the kind of major indices in the equity side. But you can apply these techniques, managing volatility, to other asset classes, but you have to be able to have a futures market or some way of efficiently changing your allocation. Otherwise, the costs just reduce the benefits.
Yes, Mark?
Very interesting talk. Did you look at duration when you looked at volatility? Because volatility only has context within a period of time, and a longer time, different volatility. Did you look at that and how that would help design a portfolio, particularly if it's a long duration retirement savings type strategy?
No, we didn't look at different durations of volatility. So our volatility is, our strategies is, well, it could be daily, hourly, weekly, monthly. It doesn't make a huge difference over those shorter horizons, but depending on your time frame. So if you were rebalancing every month or whatever, we're looking at monthly horizon. But we do it daily in most of what we do, and then you just look out over the horizon. You back test it and do all those kinds of things. But no, we don't look at except if you have a strategy where you want to rebalance monthly, then we look at the monthly forecasts and the volatility.
Okay, I think it's time to move on to our final speaker. Thanks very much, Michael. And the final speaker is our fearless leader, John Piggott from the School of Economics, talking about retirement policy issues. John.
Thank you, Warwick. So what do I do here?
There's a button there. Yep.
And I press that one?
Yes.
Here we go. So I don't have any sheets of paper, and I've got to kind of just look at what's happening here. But I was in charge of this project 4.4, which was around retirement policy issues, and it kind of leaked into aged care, because aged care becomes such an important part of retirement policy. And so there are, if I think about what the important things that have happened over the past decade or so, there are three areas that I think we've, or two important areas, and then sort of sub-areas within that. And I worked in these with many, many people, and I can only acknowledge them generically. But there are a few names will come up, but there are many more than that, and I'm very conscious that they have been an important part of this research strand. The first is around developed countries and how pension policy should be developed there, and how you might make what we have in pension policy better. And that's an important part, I know, of what Hazel has been talking about, but it's also important in a more kind of modeling context. And then the second is aging in Asia, and I'm personally very persuaded that the demographic shift that we're witnessing, particularly in the emerging nations of Asia, is very critical. And 20 years from now, if action isn't taken now in policy terms, 20 years from now, there's going to be real humanitarian distress. And there's some associated translation. So they're the three topics. I realize now that there is this delay, right? So let me talk first of all about the pension reform in developed countries. So there were some overview pieces with Hazel and with Frederik, who's been an important part of CEPAR, particularly in translation, but also in the research that he has done. And so they've focused mainly on Australia, what's happening in Australia, where we're up to, what needs to be done, that kind of thing. They're quite useful to do. They're not path-breaking research, but what they do is they, because you're involved in it, they crystallize what the genuine research questions might be that would take that particular path forward. One thing that did come out of this set of observations was that very little was actually known about the taxation of pensions. And as some of you will be aware, we have a very idiosyncratic taxation system for pensions. I used to say we had the world's best pension system, but the world's worst taxation of pension systems. So Robert Holtzmann, who's now the governor of the Reserve Bank of Austria, had resigned from the World Bank. I'm very good at picking people who have retired early from international organizations and sort of shanghaiing them into CEPAR. I've done it several times. Robert was an example. He resigned from the World Bank, retired from the World Bank, and he really didn't have anywhere to go. And so we gave him an honorary chair here, and we gave him some research money. And over a period of time, it became very clear that the taxation of pensions hadn't been clearly understood or documented. People didn't know what other countries were doing. And so we put together a conference volume, which was eventually run with CECIFO in Munich. And out of that came a conference volume on the taxation of pensions in around the world. It was published by MIT a few years ago. And that's turned out to be quite a useful volume for people, for policymakers who are seeking to take the next step in the taxation of pensions. And that's become an issue because of population aging. That's become an issue because the initial base for taxation revenue to fund pensions is beginning to shrink in many of these countries. And then as well as that, there's economy-wide modelling. Now, most of the economy-wide modelling in the Australian context has been done by Alan Woodland and George Krudner. But there was a little bit of work that was done by myself with Kagri Kumru. And the results of that, one of the things that came out from that early work, it has 2017 there, but actually the results were there in 2012, is that tight tapers are much better than loose tapers. And that was something that we promulgated to Treasury. But when I was on the taxation review in 2009, it was a big story that you didn't want tight tapers because they were distortionary. You wanted narrow tapers that spread across a large portion of the population. So it was a real change of perception, and it's perceptions which drive policy. And I think come the mid-2000s, mid-2010s, that became important in the refurbishing or the recalibration, if you like, of the age pension, which took place at that point. The other area in this piece, I've got 4 minutes left, I see. The other area of this piece was around work which I've done with colleagues in Norway. So once again, a long-standing collaboration. And Norway had a very weird pension system with very many moving parts, and there was a big reform in 2010, which made it much more uniform. And along with that, there was the Frisch Center, and the Frisch Center had population-wide data, what they called register data, administrative data, which covered everything. It was an amazing data set. And of course, being the Frisch Center, they were very good at econometrics. And so we've done some work. They didn't know a lot about pensions, right? So that's how I kind of got into it. And we ended up with 3 papers, 2 of which are on revise and resubmit still. But the finding, one of the interesting findings, I think, is that you could reduce access age of the pension, and that actually helped things along. So many countries around the world, there have been a dozen OECD countries at least, that have increased access age to the pension. You might remember, there were riots in France a few years ago. But there was a group of people whose access age was reduced from 67 to 62 to a line, right? And they kept the value of that pension actuarially fair, so there were no income effects. But what happened was that people started to draw down that pension, but they kept working as well. And the amount of work effort on the extensive margin, year on year into the future, that increased. So actually the impact on labour supply overall was 0, even though you gave them certainly, and of course the concomitant of that, the reverse of that is increasing access age probably doesn't make as much difference as people might think. The other point that came out of this was that, and this is a separate issue with a separate group of people, but reducing this access age made a big difference to disability insurance. So there were a lot of people who claimed disability in their early 60s. They didn't do that anymore because actually they could work at a more moderate pace and draw down some pension, and that solved the liquidity. It wasn't about incentives, it wasn't about substitutions, it was about liquidity as a result of this reduction in access age that made the difference in these ways. So I think that they're interesting papers, and they've informed, or they will inform, or they are informing, I think, policy development in developed countries. The other major areas I mentioned is this aging in Asia, and once again, there have been a number of reviews. George Kudner has been involved. Pippa Keefe has been involved. Raf Chomik has been involved. Been a number of people that we've done this. I've done this with and developed this. And in China particularly, I need to acknowledge Dubey, who is a senior research fellow. Her connections in China have been immense, and that enabled us actually to get quite a lot of traction in China up until about 2015, and then that declined. But we have a number of papers together, and a lot of them are around retirement age and around contribution rates, and how those things have impacted on Chinese labour supply and economic development. And as well as that, we have 1 or 2 papers on aged care in China. We had a linkage grant with a province in China looking at aged care and aged care insurance, long-term care, right? And what the costing influences of that were, and that was also very useful. More recently, we've been working in Indonesia, and this is work that's been very much involved with George Kudner, another linkage grant, help this along. And a very important finding out of that was that you could introduce a social pension, a non-contributory pension at a fairly low rate, just a poverty alleviating rate. And if you combine that with the increase in the access age, so here increases are good because the starting age is so low there, you could make everyone better off, right? Almost everyone better off over a long period of time, whether you looked at the specifics of a dynamic transition or whether you looked at the long-run equilibrium. This is work which is cast within an economic frame which is cutting edge in this context, long-run macroeconomic issues. And it's coming up with the result that actually you can do this and it doesn't hurt anyone. And in the context of the rapid aging that is taking place in emerging Asia, it's an incredibly important finding in my view. I'm going to be another minute. There have been a number of PhD students with whom I've had a significant impact on the thesis. Sometimes your name just gets put on a list, but these are people. I'm not necessarily the most important supervisor, but I've had some influence. And in terms of translation and impact, we've had a number of contributions that we've made, and others here have been involved. I mean, Mark DeCure has been involved in some of these, Raf Chomik and others. And then as well as that, I was made co-chair of a T20, a Think 20, which is a sort of weird little adjunct to the G20 activities in 2020. And we were able to push this idea of a social pension, of a non-contributory pension with poverty alleviating and in emerging Asia in that context. And that also happened in the National Academy of Medicine report. That was kind of quite interesting. It was written up in Nature Aging, which we've heard about already. But it was interesting because it was very difficult to persuade a largely American group of commissioners that actually a social pension mattered. But we did manage. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. We do have time for a quick question if anyone wants to ask John a question. Yes, Yi Young.
John, I just got two questions. One is about the superannuation and kind of like how we can consider it in the newer context. Like, I just thought that a lot of people don't see it as retirement income kind of system by itself. It's gradually considered as like a source of revenue, or most recently, like people are thinking about using superannuation to support like projects of national interest. And I wonder how we should evolve our thinking. And in relation to this, we've been doing a lot of research for other countries. And I mean, we are probably ahead of them, but like whether there's any benefit of us looking actually at them, reflecting on kind of like how we come a long way and reflecting on kind of like the original purposes of setting up the superannuation system for Australia.
What is the overall purpose of setting up a superannuation system in Australia? Is that your question?
Yes, and what we can learn from other kind of like countries' experiences.
So I think well, it's a difficult question to answer. I think I think we do have a very good system in the following. We have what I think of as an affluence tested age pension. So it's not a pension which is targeted towards destitution. It's a pension which excludes the affluent. And when you do that, what you do is you exclude from distortions people who have the most flexibility in the most important choices related to this, which is labour supply and saving. The people in the top quintile are the people who can save more or less, right? They have a lot of discretion there, and they can work more or less, much more readily than people who are poorer, who have less human capital. Their behaviour is not influenced by a subsidy in old age, a transfer in old age, a government-funded pension in old age, because they're excluded as a result of the affluence test. And so that means that there's much less distortion in the system, and also it means that there's less of a revenue requirement to fund such a pension as a result and that results in a lower labour tax distortion or low taxation distortion generally through working life. So I think that's an important piece in that first pillar. And I think Australia demonstrates you can do that very well, and we've been doing it for more than a century, and we don't notice that we have declined into a welfare state, as Singapore sometimes suggests that we have. And it frustrates me a little that Singapore is the country that so many emerging Asia countries aspire to, right? Because I think it'd be much better if they aspired to what we do. And then if you look at earnings replacement, what we've done is something on a pre-funded basis, and I think we've done it at about the right rate. So countries like the Netherlands that Hazel mentioned earlier and Switzerland have a higher contribution rate. They have a similar system of a pre-funded earnings-related pension, but the numbers are much higher. So you asked about what we might learn from other countries. I think that's one thing you learn. I don't think it should be much less, but I think it should be, I don't think it should be much more either. I think 12% is about right. People point to the underspending in retirement, but I think that has to do with self-insurance, because there are so many uninsurable events which occur in the latter part of life. And I think that's in some ways the biggest policy challenge, because when one reaches one's 60s and 70s, let me tell you, right, life is very heterogeneous. People's circumstances are so different. They own a house or they don't own a house. They have a family or they don't have a family. They're supporting someone who's disabled or they're not. Quite apart from the financial circumstances in which they find themselves. And to build a policy which has unity and structure and tractability that accommodates that heterogeneity is extremely challenging. And I think that's why aged care policy is challenging. But I think it's why some of the features of drawdown in superannuation is challenging as well. Thank you.
That's a great response, John, thanks. And I think this probably is a good time to stop and have coffee. Coffee's in the back room. And please be back in time for an 11 o'clock start. Thank you.